listening to That Jesus Podcast.
Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of That Jesus Podcast. You have made a very wise decision today, dear listener, in tuning into this esteemed program. I'm your host, Titus,
Esteemed
and
by whom?
I am joined by the Lord and his people. I'm joined by my co-host today, Drew Lattin. How are you?
I'm doing okay.
And we are also joined by a friend from church, Anthony Whitmer. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
And I'm doing well.
Great.
You didn't ask, Titus?
Sorry. I know he's doing well because we have a deep spiritual bond from being part of the same church.
Awesome.
The reason I have Anthony on is because he helped me interview our upcoming guest at the end of the show, Gary Miller, so definitely stay tuned for that. But we thought we'd pull him in for our lovely segments here at the beginning as well. So I wanted to ask you, Drew, before we get rolling here, how have you been spending all the Patreon money that's been coming in?
I haven't even looked, so I guess I'm missing out on that sweet dough.
It's been incredible. I just want to thank all of our many patrons. You know, if you go on our Patreon, you can see just the hundreds of people who are signing up.
Titus, you have to understand that we need to give them rewards somehow, special rewards so they feel like insiders, and we really haven't done that yet.
I wrote in the description that if you sow into our ministry, you will reap help. What I said is, and I quote
New
myself,
apostolic reformation.
No. And I quote, "You will reap mere health and wealth, and all of your wildest dreams will come true." What more reward could they want than that? Anyways, let's go to our first segment. It's time for That Weekly Buzz. All right, Drew, what you got?
What I've got for this, do I have to go first every single week? I wanted to talk about the New York Times article about surgeons attaching a pig kidney to a human, and it worked. And I wanted to wonder if we felt like this is an okay thing or an overreach by science, and most of all, can Orthodox Jews get pig kidneys attached to humans? But that's not really what I'm going to go with, because what really hit me was the fact, and this is just a Yahoo
No
News
one's hearing your
article.
second story. They're all thinking about that.
Yeah, you can email us about whether that's an okay life decision if your kidney's failing and you want a pig to help you out. But I've been trying to buy a computer, or wanting to buy a computer, because mine is dead. I'm actually borrowing one to do this segment. And then I read this headline: America isn't running out of everything just because of a supply chain crisis. America is running out of everything because Americans are buying so much stuff. And I just wanted to make a confession to my accountability group here on the internet.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's unfortunate. I read that and I was like, oh, you Americans are so sad that you're so focused on consumerism and you're buying up all the world and everything, and it's still not satisfying you. My second thought is, I better buy my computer quick before we can't get any more.
Yeah, that's generally how runs on things go.
Yeah, Anthony, what was the last thing you bought that you shouldn't have?
Probably a free iced macchiato from Dunkin' Donuts to celebrate my birthday.
Okay.
Wait, is your birthday today?
No, but it was my coupon for a free drink from Dunkin' Donuts expired today, so...
Okay.
I love that flex, though. Like, I ask you what was the last thing you wasted money on, and you're like, a free drink at Dunkin' Donuts. So,
That's
but what's
how
your news
holy
story, Titus?
Anthony is. So what I want to talk about is what I'm sure is on everybody's mind. This is the biggest thing that has happened in a little while in our world, in the conservative Anabaptist world that I'm not sure I'm a part of. But it's the kidnapping of the Christian Aid Ministries missionaries in Haiti. And I've been following this story really closely. It's
Sure.
really crazy to see this ministry on global headlines, and someone from our church has a cousin who is part of this group, so it's striking pretty close to home, and it's obviously just really devastating, and been keeping them in our prayers. But what I wanted to touch on a little bit here is sort of the reaction I've seen to this online, specifically on Twitter and in the comment sections of news articles, which you should never read. I've noticed two basic buckets that the reactions are falling into. So on the left, I'm seeing these are horrible missionaries with white savior complexes, and they should have never been in Haiti trying to convert these people, and they basically deserve it. Like, I've literally seen many comments that basically are saying that. And then on the right, I'm seeing, oh, look how bad Haitians are, and Biden is letting them into the country. It's really, really gross the way the political extremes have reacted to this. I'm like, is there no like sense of decency anymore? I guess Twitter's not where I should be going to try
Titus,
to find
have you
that.
seen anybody with comments saying, and I kind of hesitate to even go here, but comments with people saying that, oh, this is sort of retribution for the sexual abuse that Cam just kind of ignored for decades or years and years anyhow in Haiti. Have people been linking that up?
I haven't seen a lot of that. I've been following that really closely because as soon as this story broke, I was like, oh boy, you know. I haven't seen much of it. I've seen some, like one tweet or so referencing that. I don't think most people know it happened because the major news organizations are not putting that front and center in this story. I think NPR mentioned it briefly, but didn't really like have a lot of outrage about it. So, I mean, I'm thankful about that, not because I don't think they should be held accountable, but rather because I don't want Christians to be represented in that way. I don't want the name of Jesus to be dragged through the mud.
Yeah. And it's really not fair. Like, you have families, and I have friends with, you know, nieces and nephews and cousins that are in Haiti. You have real people there, and as soon as you politicize something like this, like, there's a time and a place for that, but, you know, the cliche too soon, I think really does apply here.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I mean, I was thinking as I was reading a lot of these comments about the term missionary, because, you know, that's how the story broke. Even though they're doing humanitarian aid, you know, they were coined or they were termed missionaries, which I mean, I guess missionaries do meet physical needs as well. But I was wondering, you know, how helpful is this term? And thinking about it from three angles. So first of all, it's the people we're trying to reach, especially if they're not Christians and they're unreached or in countries that are hostile to the gospel. That's a non-starter, is to call yourself a missionary. For one, you can't get in the country. Like, thinking specifically of India, where we're hoping to move, you know, we can't get missionary visas, and if we tell them that we're missionaries, they will certainly not give us any sort of visa. So we can say that, oh, we can kind of pull a Corrie ten Boom and just lie and say we're not missionaries when we actually are. Or we could consistently reject the term as a description of what we're doing and just say, hey, we're expats. In our case, starting a business there, and because we're Christians, we will try to reach people, but we're not missionaries. So that's the one angle, you know, that the people we're actually trying to reach are pretty hostile to the term missionary. And then from the other side, you know, our society, and I just realized now that I forgot to do the mere devotion buzz. Oh wait, that isn't yet. This is still that weekly buzz, but it's about mission, so it's kind of merely devoted as well. Anyhow, so our society clearly from the responses do not appreciate the term missionary and what missions has represented with colonialism. Hello, Rebecca Mui, and the way those things have been wedded. And just even the idea of converting people in general, our society hates, which, I mean, at a certain point, you can't avoid the offense there. And then thirdly, and I was thinking about this because the only people I still use that term with are not like my atheist friends who will raise their hackles at it, or the people I'm trying to reach who will raise their hackles at it. The only people I still use the term with are Christians. And I was thinking, why do I do that? I think, I mean, partially it's a term that they're familiar with, but and that's somewhat of an accurate description of what we're going to do in India. But I think part of it has to do with, like, there's sort of a what's the word I'm looking for? A halo effect when you call yourself a missionary.
Certainly,
and maybe that's partially why I've done it. And that's also not a great reason to use the term, right? That there's this first tier of Christians who are in full-time ministry, and at the top of even that tier are those who are missionaries because they're sacrificing so much. That goes against a lot of the way of Jesus as well. So is this a term that's salvageable, or like the term evangelical, should we abandon it?
Well, I know this will come as a shock to everyone, but I'm going to disagree with you.
Okay.
First of all, agree with you that, yes, in many cases it's unhelpful across the board. And in many cases, it like really can't be used. Like you can't actually be a missionary in some countries. However, actually missionaries, like you can still get a missionary visa in Thailand. You kind of have to be grandfathered into the system, but you can get a missionary visa in Thailand. And a lot of countries, I think especially some African nations, still hold missionaries in high regard. I think it's better to say we need to do a really thorough job thinking about what missionary means to our audience. Because even if they like the term, the people you're reaching out to like the term missionary and call you the missionary, that doesn't mean you should use it. But the flip side, and I'd say this applies to your first and second scenarios, a lot of times if I say I'm not a missionary, but I'm doing quote unquote missions work, I'm evangelizing, I'm doing humanitarian work, I'm trying to reach out, I'm trying to plant churches, it feels really disingenuous to some to say, oh, no, I'm not a missionary. It's like, well, I'm not a Christian, I'm a Jesus follower. It's like, yes, but
I'm not
a
Mennonite, I'm an Anabaptist. I'm not an Anabaptist, I'm a Kingdom Christian.
Yeah, exactly.
Matthew Miliani.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to give a shout out too. And so I think that you want to be honest. You also want to be really thoughtful about what it means. And so I'm going to sort of one-up you here, Titus, and say we shouldn't move away from the term itself. We should be moving away from the concept.
No, I think the opposite. The concept of missionary work is absolutely vital. It's the term that maybe is expendable. Or is that? I don't think that's what you meant by the concept. I hope not. Like the idea that we should reach the unreached.
The idea that you have a special class of people in Christendom that are specially designated. Sure. And like, I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think the concept of apostle would be better. But that's such a loaded term. I don't really endorse the use of that either. But
I mean, that's what missionary means, basically, sent one.
Apostolic type ministry where you're reaching out and sharing the gospel for the first time. So really, if we're thinking apostle equals missionary, it would be very reasonable to say that the folks in Haiti that were kidnapped and held hostage, better to say hostages, that the hostages, they weren't missionaries, they were humanitarian workers.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you've been more specific, and frankly, I think saying that they're humanitarian workers, they're Jesus loving, Jesus exalting, Jesus spreading humanitarian workers. Yeah, a lot of liberal secular folks aren't going to like that, but it is more accurate and it's probably a little less triggering for them.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts, Anthony?
The one thought I had is that I don't like the term missionary because it tends to denote that there's some people that have that job and some that don't. And some of us probably all grew up hearing, everybody's supposed to be if you're a Christian, you're a missionary. It tends to classify people as something that maybe everybody should just be doing wherever they are. And then the people in Haiti are humanitarian workers. But that's just some thoughts I have without putting a lot of thought into it.
Sure.
So can I ask you guys a little bit about just my experience and what you think, Anthony, saying you don't like that, how it separates them? Like, I spent the first 9 years of my marriage on the mission field, and we came back with nothing. And our peers had a long work history. They had houses that they've been making payments on for 10 years. They had, wedding presents that they had used and gone through, and we didn't have any of that. And it was like we actually made sacrifices as missionaries. And I had several cases over the years when we'd come back and do presentations in churches, and people would come up after us and be like, oh man, I wish I could get paid to serve Jesus like you guys are getting paid. Like my mission field is my kids, but nobody asks me to share in church about my mission field to my children, and nobody asks, nobody offers to give us extra funds for our ministry. And so I guess I'm coming back again from the other side, and I'm like, missionaries do, in a sense, those who are called to apostolic or cross-cultural ministry, I think that it could be argued that they are worthy of honor and they are worthy of recognition. And yet I don't want to create different classes either.
I agree. I agree with what you're saying. I don't necessarily have an argument there. It's just my perspective has been trying to be a so-called missionary while holding a job, while living in America. I'm not going out raising money to support myself. And that's what I wish more people here were doing. And yet I have nothing wrong with the people that spent 9 years in a foreign country doing something.
Yeah, if someone's local, I mean, John Piper draws a distinction between local ministry as evangelism and frontier work as missionary work or apostolic work. And I think there is a difference. I think probably what you're trying to get to, Anthony, is that no one is off the hook. And the term missionary can put people off the hook. For evangelism, which is the topic of today's interview and segment of Mere Devotion. So our topic today, the title of this episode is Reaching America. That's the title of Gary Miller's book, who's coming up in a second. And
that's the thing you don't think we should do at all.
What?
That's the thing you don't think anybody should do. You think that's a total waste of time.
That's not the case. I do think that the church as a rule should be focused more on reaching the unreached than people who are already reached. But I do think that definitely there's a place to reach America. So I wanted each of us to share a little bit about, not as a way of bragging, but a testimony of ways that we're trying to reach out successfully or unsuccessfully to those around us. So let's start with you, Drew.
Well, I'm kind of low-key pastoring a church here, and
they're not Christians, the people in your church.
Yeah, I know. I'm just trying to tick through things here. But we really, as a church, are asking ourselves, like, what is the next step? Like, I had a brother share last week, Titus, and some of our audiences kind of followed our church saga in some ways, say, this is the first time, these past 6 to 8 months is the first time church has actually been happy for me. This is the best experience I've ever had with church, ever. And that's great, but we are asking this question, what does it look then to change from an inward focus and a support and recovery approach to church to being outward focused? So there's that. I don't have a lot of active ministry. I teach English language arts at a tribal school, reaching a minority population that has a lot of socioeconomic challenges, and the young people do. I don't want to say too much about that because it is my job. But again, talking with some friends at church, you guys can criticize me after this because it does feel pretty low key. But when I seek to conduct myself in front of my classroom as if Jesus was teaching the classroom, like, I get angry and frustrated with my students because they're middle schoolers, and middle schoolers can be frustrating sometimes. But I really do try to remember that a kind word, encouragement, gentleness, showing those fruits of the Spirit really is a testimony in and of itself. That's kind of where I'm at right now. Like, check the box because I'm teaching English at a tribal school. But I want to do more with that, and I actually think that for me and for us as a church, we're kind of in the middle of saying what that looks like. So, 1 out of 10.
And you're probably more of a pastor. You're probably more of a pastor than an evangelist, I'm guessing.
That's a really nice.
I know you.
A nice get out of jail free card. Yeah.
No, I think it's legitimate though. Anyways,
and I think
so if I call myself a pastor, that means I don't have to actually evangelize, and that's really nice for those of us who are kind of shy like me.
There you go.
And I think trying to act like Jesus in the front of a classroom of middle schoolers who don't have as much exposure to that is a worthy effort as well.
For sure. All right, Anthony, how about you?
Well, one of our key intent here is to have a family over or someone over for dinner one night a week. Preferably a neighbor.
I like that.
Doesn't happen every week, but that's just whether they're Christians or Muslim, it doesn't matter. Just a way to know people and interact with people. Also, yeah, there's a young fellow that's homeless that some of us have been spending a lot of time with, and I mentioned in the interview, he spent the other afternoon here sleeping on our living room floor while some of the children played around him, but he was tired and he was out. But just being in those people's lives. With him, I've worked out at the gym with him a few times, went there with him, just taking an interest in their life, what they do. Yeah, that's kind of what I have going right now.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm in a place of really trying to find more opportunities, especially with international folks. I've actually been talking to Finney about this, and he sent me recently a bunch of links at UVA or links of organizations at UVA that are providing opportunities.
That's University of Virginia, Albuquerque.
Yep. Charlottesville. And so especially this winter when I'm not cutting grass, I really hope to make more connections and reach out to international folks. We are trying to reach our neighbors unsuccessfully. It's another story. But, I think that the harvest is very ripe when it comes to international folks.
That's cool, Titus. And that really would be where my heart is, but I live in northern Wisconsin, and, we don't have any international folks.
All right. Well, we are going to turn it over to Gary Miller. I had never heard Gary Miller speak before this and found him to be quite articulate, and I'm sure our dear listeners will find that to be the case as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, Gary Miller. We're joined today by Gary Miller. Gary is a prolific author within the conservative Anabaptist world. He's written a lot of books. How many is it, Gary?
I'm not sure. I haven't.
You've lost track.
Some of them are small books. Some are manuals for other countries, and so I'm not sure how you count exactly.
Sure. Yeah, well, your latest book is Reaching America, which is the one that we're hoping to chat about today. And I pulled in a brother from my church, Anthony Whitmer, to help me do this interview. The reason I pulled Anthony in is because, America's a little more of his calling. As our listeners know, I'm interested in foreign missions. And Anthony is stationed in Richmond, Virginia. He moved there with his family to try to reach out to the city there. And also, he's been part of a little book a week challenge this year and has been reading a book every week. Are you still on that?
As of the end of September, I was. I have
so
a lot
you're
of reading
tapering off a
next
little
week to stay on track for October, I think. But
yeah. Well, one of those books has been Gary's latest book, Reaching America, and you were really encouraged by that book and had some questions for him. So I'm just going to turn it over to you. I might chime in here and there, but yeah, what are some of the things that you wanted to talk to Gary about his latest book?
Well, I've read it twice now because the first time I read it was midsummer maybe, and then when you brought up closer to the time of doing the podcast, I read it again to get some good questions written down, get an idea as to what I wanted to ask. And so, Gary, I sent you some of the questions I had in mind. I have answers for a lot of them because they're in the book, but I thought maybe we can somehow, without just going over everything the book says, hopefully give some ideas maybe that you can explain better by talking rather than writing, just to inspire people, whet people's appetites for reading the book. I saw it, and the picture on the front looks like a modern American suburb, or housing development. And so that intrigued me because we live in Richmond right now, which is where we live currently is the suburbs. We are interested in living closer to the city. We also spent 4 years in the South Bronx, so that's a vastly different picture than what we see on the front. And I would have grown up in rural Lebanon County, Pennsylvania, which is probably also pretty close to what you can see on the front of this book. A good mixture of small town and farming country. And each of the three places I've lived have a different demographic to them, different ways you would go about reaching people, could go about reaching people. And I think you do a good job of just, in this book, of giving ideas for inner city and out in the country on a farm. Anyhow, so the first question I have for you is just, give us a little bit of an idea as to what inspired you to write a book like this. Like, America's a pretty Christian nation, supposedly. So why are we concerned about reaching America?
Sure. So anyone who reads very many of my books would know that my books usually circle around my own inner wrestlings, whether it's dealing with finance or technology or, in this case, outreach. And so in my books, I tend to ask a lot of questions, and sometimes that's to make people think, and sometimes it's because I don't have the answers, and it's easier to ask the question than it is to give the answer when I'm not sure about it. And so in this book, I would say that is the case. There are some issues here that I wrote about that maybe I don't have all the answers for, but hopefully we can think about it and pray about it together. But as far as the purpose for the book, I think it's obvious to any of us in the conservative Anabaptists in our constituencies that there is a lack of new last names in our churches. Just a lot of the same names over and over again. In fact, sometimes I work at Christian Aid Ministries and I'll hear someone say, well, that's not a Mennonite name, or that's not an Amish name, or whatever. And so there's obviously, from my perspective, a problem. And one of the things that's bothered me is that sometimes we seem comfortable with that. We're okay with that fact, that it's just kind of us and nobody else, and it's kind of normal. But as we read the book of Acts, it's like totally the opposite. The early church was exciting, and things were happening, and new people were coming in, and we put down Acts and go back to church on Sunday morning, and there's something very boring about this. It's not the same as what we saw in the book of Acts. In fact, in many of our churches, there's very few seekers coming to Christ, coming to our own congregations. And so I get asked this fairly frequently, especially I would say from youth, is why is church life so different? Why is it radically different than what I'm reading in the book of Acts? And the next question is it because we've lost interest in evangelism? Is it because we have become more interested in our nice homes and our big businesses, and we forgot our mission? Is that the problem? Or is it a possibility that we're dealing with a culture that has been inoculated against the gospel? People have an inner picture of what Christianity is, and frankly, they're not very interested in it. They see Christians many times as uncaring, uninteresting, and unloving. And so I would say, in short, one of the reasons I wrote the book was to wrestle with this question: is it us or is it them? And I think most of us, if we're honest, we'd have to say that it's both. It's partly our fault, partly we're dealing with a culture that is very difficult to reach. So I work in developing countries and poor countries, and that's my primary job, and it's totally different there. There's a lot more interest, there's a curiosity, people want to know. So that's partly the problem, but there's also, I see us still using techniques to reach out to people that might have worked well in the 1950s, but our culture's changed. We're not living in 1950. And so we don't it seems like, know how to respond to that change in culture. So we keep using the same tools that were used 50 years ago, 70 years ago. And so in the book, I talk about the difference between Acts 2, on Peter on the day of Pentecost. He came in with a message of just repent. And that worked well for the Jewish people who had a foundational knowledge of what Christianity was. Now, they had a fear of God. You go to Acts 17, and Paul uses a completely different approach on Mars Hill. It was like the soil needed to be tilled up first before you start planting. And so one of the issues I think we're dealing with today is our churches have trouble understanding that change, and they also have trouble being realistic, analyzing programs that they've been using for years, and being willing to drop those when they're not working. So purpose of the book, I would say, is to help us rethink our mission, changing culture, and take another look at how God is wanting us to reach out right here in America.
Yeah, it's so interesting you brought up the example of repentance, because Anthony was just at my house last night, and we were talking about this, about, how he's been reading in the scriptures that, Jesus told his disciples to go out and preach everywhere that men should repent, right? And we were talking about this, like, why don't we do it as much? And I think it is partially what you mentioned, that our culture, because we don't really have that foundation of Judaism, where repentance was all throughout the Old Testament prophets. A lot of people in the West don't even really know what that word means. So yeah, I think maybe we do need to take more of a Mars Hill approach there.
Well, there does seem to be just a basic lack of fear of God in our culture. I noticed that with my neighbors. There's just not a fear of God, and so it is hard to. It's like planting seeds where the soil isn't prepared for that yet.
Yeah.
So the church I came from before we moved here, they have a lot of programs. Some of them are good. Some of them, it's maybe time to rethink them. But you look over the last 60 years, what has changed in America that maybe makes tent meetings, like with Billy Graham's tent meetings, work? His crusades, would they have as much of an effect in 2021 as they did in even 2001 or 1960?
It's a great question. I remember as a little boy, my father was a minister, and I remember going into his office, and he had these books on the wall, old books that were thick. They were 2 or 3 inches thick. I remember a couple of them were on the topic of a debate that happened back in the 1800s. So a debate took place on, like, the mode of baptism or some detail, and the whole community turned out to listen to this debate about this issue, and an entire book was written about it. And as you read the book, you realize that this was the major event that happened. I mean, it was like everybody gathered. They were selling food outside. It was like nothing was going on in this town, and suddenly there was a huge event, and it was like the circus came to town, but they were actually discussing theological issues. And I remember thinking as a little boy,
sounds like heaven to me.
Yeah, I remember thinking as a little boy, who even cares? And who would show up today to listen to a debate about some detail of how to live out Christianity? And so there's obviously some major shifts have happened in our culture that we need to be honest about. One of those that's obvious is just affluence. People who are out of options are the ones that tend to seek God. And so money provides lots of options. If you are depressed, you can afford counseling. You can buy pills to take care of it. If you're bored, you can buy more toys. If you haven't live in a bad neighborhood, you can move. You have all kinds of options. Need relief? Take an exotic vacation. And wealth provides all these options. And even though, I live around neighbors that are constantly trying something different, a new vacation, a new cruise, a new something. And they will admit it's elusive in their quiet moments, or especially recently with COVID, sickness, that kind of thing. They'll talk about that. But there's always an assumption with wealth that a little more would take care of this problem I'm dealing with. Another thing that's changed, I mentioned it earlier, is what I call inoculation. Just people have had a little bit of what they think of as Christianity. They assume they understand what it is, and frankly, they don't want it. Another one's technology. We live in a culture of just electronic pacifiers. Whenever things aren't going well, why we grab that thing, and we can entertain ourselves for a little bit until that little fear or worry passes, and then we move on. We live in a world of continual diversion. And in the past, I think people sat on their porches more, they interacted with their neighbors more, they needed each other more. Today, I can walk through our neighborhood. I live in a close to town here, right on the edge of town, and I can walk through a neighborhood and not see an individual the whole time. I can walk a mile and maybe see one person. They might be driving, and the reason is people are inside. They have their electronics, and so there's a lot less interaction, and a lot less chance to dialogue and even build a relationship with unbelievers.
Mm-hmm.
And so typically we as Anabaptists, in our retreat mode anyway, we tend to just interact with people that are about like us. And sometimes I talk to people who don't even know their neighbors, don't even know who they are. So that's a cultural change that's happened. So it is difficult, and there's multiple reasons, but we can only work on the parts that are in our power that have to do with what we can actually do and affect change in.
So I asked how the culture around us has changed. Do you think there's anything that has happened to us as Christians? Like, have we changed?
Absolutely.
The story that you opened the book up with, where they are talking about Jesus and everything that's going on. I guess you made up the story anyhow, just as it might have been in the early part of the book of Acts. People were talking about the miracles that were happening, and people's lives were being changed, and they couldn't stop talking about it. I guess that's one thing that I think about very personally. Like, it's very easy for me just to be comfortable with just like the culture around me. I have everything I want. Does Jesus really make a difference to me?
That's right.
I'm answering my own question there, but
yeah, the very things I just mentioned, affluence, technology, all of that has an impact on us as well. Mm-hmm. And so it's very easy for us to get diverted by business, even by church life, by interaction with friends and nice Sunday evening pizza parties with our friends and everything else, where we aren't even thinking about our neighbors anymore. We're just simply thinking about the people that we know and our own lives. And it's very easy for us to become ingrown to where we don't think about our neighbors anymore. Absolutely. That's a huge change. However, I think one of the things that happened in the early church, I don't think they were moved primarily, maybe even by preaching, as much as changed lives. And you still see that. You still see that in developing countries where there's first generation Christianity. When there's a radical change in life, there's always church growth that goes with it. And so, yeah, I think we need to set up and realize that we are not as sold out as what we read in the book of Acts.
Yeah, so these are some of the challenges we're facing. You mentioned the challenges of our changing culture, and sometimes the problem is us ourselves. So I guess my question is, what's the solution? What are some good methods for actually reaching those around us? I used to do a lot of street evangelism where I would walk up to complete strangers and ask them where they're going to go after they die, or some other really kind of on the nose question. And we had a lot of good conversations, but saw very little fruit. Now, there was one Muslim actually in a shopping mall in Ohio that did actually become a believer. I don't know if he's still following Jesus. I need to reach out to Jay Stoltzfus has been discipling him. So it wasn't completely fruitless, but we didn't see a lot of good results from that. What do you think about street evangelism? And if maybe that's not always the most effective way of going about it, do you have any other techniques?
Well, I'm always slow to discourage any effort people are making out there. My own experience, so I've been involved in some of that, not a lot, but if going out on the street and just trying to reach out to people and communicate. As a new community here, we have done that collectively, even just tried different ways. But I would say that the most in our setting, the best results we have seen are from individuals observing church life, observing how we operate as a family, how we love each other, and there's a cry in America for community,
Yes.
and when they observe sacrificial love, there's a drawing to that. And so, even though I would say this, I'm not opposed to going out and passing out tracts. I'm not sure that's very effective today in our culture. I'm not opposed to it, but I'm just not sure that's actually the primary way that we can actually move the gospel out into the unreached here in America today. I think church life is really going to be much more effective. Jesus really said that. He said, "By this shall all men know you're my disciples, if you have love one for another." And we tend to think that it's going to be if we have love for the lost. That's what's going to really show people that we care. Actually, Jesus said if you have love for each other, that's what's powerful. That's what's going to attract people to come. And I still think that's probably more than ever. That's probably more true today than ever, really.
And you said people are looking for that, which that leads to another question I have here is what you make the statement in the beginning of the book that there is still spiritual interest, especially you hear through your work with Cam's billboard evangelism. Like there is people asking questions. There's people looking. How have you seen people looking for spiritual interest, community? What do those people look like around us?
So I see people who are disillusioned around us with American culture. They know something's missing in their lives. We have a neighbor close to us here right now who they've been coming to our home for, I don't know, probably a couple months maybe. They probably every week they stop in just to talk and chat, and they have questions. They have no real experience with Christianity. I have not invited them to church yet. We're just building a relationship and getting to know them at this point. But they are curious about who we are, who God is. They have lots of questions, and I'm looking forward to getting to those questions eventually. Right now, we're just building a relationship with them. But I think in our culture, our tendency is to jump too fast into hard questions and try to move into Acts 2 before we've dealt with Acts 17. That'd be my assumption. And so there are all kinds of people. You ask what kinds of people. So Cam's billboard, that was originally where this book started out. There was a lot of responses, a lot of good responses to hard questions that were going out every day on these billboard calls. And so the billboard team started sending me the reports, trying to get me to write a book on this topic of billboard evangelism. I was not initially interested in it at all. I told them I didn't think that our need was actually more billboards out there. I'm not opposed to billboards, but I don't see that as the biggest need. What I feel like is the biggest need is, or the greatest need would be for each of us individually to start reaching out to our neighbors. And they said, well, go ahead and write a book and use this as examples of how to answer some of those hard questions. And that's really how the book started. But people who call in on the billboard, there's all different kinds of people. Some of them are just simply not willing to walk away from their sin. They live a life of sin. They're curious about the billboard, but they're not interested actually in making a change. Some of them find Jesus's commands very difficult. Divorce and remarriage. Many calls are on homosexuality. Many of these people have been hurt by Christianity, by improper responses to their situation. Mm-hmm. Maybe they've experienced a lack of love. So there's all kinds of individuals who are curious. Some of those end up then coming to our Anabaptist churches and not feeling welcome. Mm-hmm. They don't feel like we listen very well. I've had phone calls from individuals who have been part of an Anabaptist church for quite a while, and they're discouraged. And And one of the things that almost every one of them has said is that the Anabaptist people are not very good at listening and many times have an arrogant attitude. And that's something I think we can learn from is, are we curious about them? Do we actually care about them as a person? Or are we simply looking for trophies to put in our church to show that we've reached out to somebody? And they detect that very quickly. They detect what you're actually interested in. And sometimes when I've had people tell me that they were curious, they've been going to churches, but as soon as people are initially very friendly, but as soon as the church member discerns they're probably not going to keep coming there, they lose interest in them. And they pick up that sort of thing. They find out who we actually are and what our interest is.
But when I read that, you made a statement like that in your book about how we do a poor job of listening and we can come across arrogant. That really resonated with me because I have seen that in my own culture and in relating to people from other cultures in church life. And it's really noticeable when it's 90% of the people are one culture and you have another person who is from a very different kind of, I think we call it warm and cold. We as German background people tend to be rather stoic and cold, and when you bring a Latin American into the picture, they tend to be a lot more warm culture where they're a lot quicker to hug, and you stop talking who you're talking to and greet somebody walking by. Stuff that I did because it was normal was offensive to them. And I can choose to look at him and say he has to get with the program, or I can say maybe I have something to learn. And that has taught me a lot just relating to people from other cultures.
Yeah, and one of the segments of people who really feel this thing of the arrogance are those who join and are part for a while and then they leave. I remember getting a phone call years ago from an individual who they said they wanted me to write a book, and the title of the book, they said, I have the title for you and I've got all the contents ready to go. They said the title of it is Why They Don't Stay. And here's the reason we don't want to stay. And they went on to describe why they're just frustrated. So these are individuals that typically, I think in the book I might have called it the person seeking truth. Someone who really is trying to find more. They typically come in the door to Christianity in an evangelical church. They read the New Testament. They realize there's some doctrines being missed. And so they keep searching. And so they come to an Anabaptist church and they think, aha, this is exactly what I wanted. And so they join this group, and over a process of several years, they begin to maybe point out some hypocrisy, point out some areas here that you say this, but you do this, and this doesn't make sense. And it's at that point when, if they're not listened to, now their ideas aren't always good, but if we're not willing to listen to them, if we just defend whatever it is we're doing, all they get from that is arrogance. And I remember one individual told me that when I came into this, I think it was a Mennonite church, when I came into this church, I was on a journey seeking God, and I assumed that all these people were also on a journey seeking God. Mm-hmm. But a few years later, I realized they weren't seeking God. They felt like they already arrived. Mm-hmm. And so that's the when that happens, you've lost a good resource, because many of these people are very good at pointing out our hypocrisy. They're very good at pointing out our flaws if we'll listen. Again, they're not always right. We can't listen to everything, but we should at least hear them out.
No, that speaks. I resonate with that completely, and it's that idea even for myself of just continually seeking God. And the longer I live here, the longer I'm a part of the church here, the more I realize how much more I need to learn. There's just
sometimes too. When we speak disparagingly of other groups, I'm not sure why we feel like we have to do that. But we speak disparagingly of maybe evangelical groups, point out their flaws. sometimes we're pointing out and speaking disparagingly of the very people that led these people to Christ. That doesn't go over very well with them. So we have to be careful with that. If we just would focus on truth and not try to speak disparagingly of other groups, we'd be much better off, really.
We do, but I think of that a lot. It's easy to point out the faults of other groups, but yet you have to give them credit where credit. There are people trying to do what's right, and
That's
God
right.
can use that.
How do you have any advice on how to, you mentioned we need to build a relationship first, but often what I find is that if we don't bring up spiritual things early and we've built a relationship, it becomes more and more awkward to eventually bring that up, especially if you're doing something like, really challenging someone who you do not believe is currently in the kingdom of heaven, and telling them, hey, look, I don't think you're following Jesus. Maybe they think they are, or maybe they're not interested in Christianity. But do you have any advice on, when is the right time to do that in a relationship, and how to bridge that conversation without it being awkward or feeling, offensive to them? And of course, we can't avoid all offense, but.
Very good question. And I don't want to give the impression of what I'm saying is go out and build relationships with people and don't say anything about spirituality or spiritual life or bring up the name of Jesus. I don't mean that. So in our home, again, I hate to even say it because I don't feel like I do a very good job of this, but I do try to live our life the same. When we have people in our home, we go ahead and have evening devotions with them, Muslim, whoever. There's people in our community here. We've reached out some to college students, and we have a lot of foreign students that come through our home, and many of them are Muslim. And we go ahead and have devotions, pray. We talk about God, but I don't push it on them. I want them to know who we are, but I'm not directly pushing it on them. I don't want them to feel like I'm bringing them into our home as a bait and switch type thing. That here's some good food now. Here's what I'm going to tell you about Jesus right now. I like for that to come from them. I like for the questions to come. And sometimes if we're open about who we are and we talk about what God is doing, they will begin to ask questions then. And I find that much easier, a better format than if I begin to push immediately. So your question is very good. I think it should come up early. I'm not interested in acting like we're not Christians here and then somehow down the road sneak that in. I think we need to be very upfront right in the beginning. This is who we are. And frankly, dressing different helps with that. Especially with Muslims. We have a tremendous opportunity with the Muslim people in America right now. Just the fact that we dress modestly is a huge opportunity. We have a family that we work with quite a bit, and they came from Syria, and they're afraid to even take their children to the park because of what they might see there. But they're comfortable coming to our home because they know that modesty will be there. So I don't think we should ever be embarrassed or ashamed of who we are and how we live, hopefully. But I do think we need to be careful about too quickly pushing into their life until they know that we actually care about them as a person before we push very hard. And if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'm glad you brought up international students because, like I mentioned, I used to do a lot of street evangelism to Americans, and recently I found that, teaching English and doing other things as ways to build relationships with folks from other countries who are here, at our college studying, or, even Chinese visiting scholars has been, I've seen way more fruit. I've seen way more hunger for the gospel. And, we wanted to have you on because we don't think it's right to give up on Americans. So I'm glad we're hearing some good advice on how to reach our American neighbors. But have you seen the same sort of hunger in the lives of, or more hunger for God in international folks? And do you think that if we're seeing more hunger there, that we should focus there more?
So I feel like I'm looking through a keyhole as far as my perspective. I'm not seeing everyone. there's others out there that could speak more into foreign students. We have simply, in fact, our congregation, there's different families in our local community that reaches out to foreign students. As far as fruit from that, as far as seeing them with a strong spiritual interest, no, I have not seen that. They typically are interested. They're curious. They ask some good questions. My hope is that they will, even when they return back to their country, take a different picture of Christianity than when they came to America. But I have not seen, I can't say that I see a lot more hunger in them than I'm seeing in the average American right now around me.
Do you know what countries they're from primarily?
Oh,
Or you're not sure?
we've had Iraq, we've had the West Bank and Israel, we've had Syria, Myanmar, Bangladesh.
So mostly Muslims, probably.
Mostly Egyptian. The other night I talked to one from Egypt. Most of them would be Muslim. There's been some from China. Would not be some Buddhists and so forth.
You're talking about having people into your home, and that was one thing I wanted to, a question I had, or it was a tip that I picked out of the book. And frankly, especially since we live here in Richmond, it has been our greatest tool in reaching neighbors particularly. But even others who aren't necessarily living right here in our neighborhood, just having them, opening our home up to meals, or we had a homeless young fellow that spent the afternoon here sleeping on the floor the other day, taking a nap.
He could take a nap in your house.
Hey, he did.
Must be the power of the Spirit, miracles. He has 5 young children, so I'm not saying your house is bad.
Some of them were sleeping at the time, so that once it started to get louder, he woke up. So what tips, you say a lot in this book, and I'm right there with you, but for people that haven't read it, what tips, what advice would you have, what input would you have as far as inviting people into your home, opening your homes up, using that, rather than having street meetings, even if you can do that, but like, how can we use our homes right where we are every day, our everyday lives? You mentioned going about your normal life, having family devotions, even if you have visitors there. That's something we aren't as good at doing, even though we talk about wanting to do that more. Is there other input you have, ways to encourage people?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. It's an interesting topic because, there are many topics that in the New Testament Jesus does not speak explicitly to, even the apostles. If you go to the New Testament and try to find out how to marry somebody, or how to baptize someone, or how to ordain someone, or whatever, the New Testament is stunningly short on details. You go back to the Old Testament, Leviticus, God can be very, very explicit when he wants to.
Mm-hmm.
But in the New Testament, we don't find that kind of detail. And so, to me, what that means is when there is detail, we should sit up and take notice.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus told us explicitly how to invite people to our home. He told us who not to invite. He told us who we should invite. And yet I would say as Anabaptists, that section of Scripture is one of the most ignored teachings of Jesus. So he said that you should invite, you should not invite, first of all, your friends, your family, your rich neighbors. You should not invite that. You should not invite people who can return the favor to you. Or I like to say people who are capable of doing something for you. You should avoid inviting those people. And you should invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, the people, in other words, who cannot do anything for you.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, I would say we do just the opposite. We tend to, and I'm speaking with a broad brush here,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm speaking about myself as well. My tendency is to invite people who are about like me, demographically, economically, spiritually. Try to find people that are about like me, and we even say things like, well, it's your turn to come to our house. We're doing the exact thing that Jesus said, now don't do this.
Mm-hmm.
Don't take turns. He was very, very explicit about it. And so I've had to reevaluate, how do I use my home? And am I willing to put my home on the altar and let God use my home? Frankly, there are some people that we have in our home that I don't get anything out of it. It's not something that's just exciting. However, those are the people that I think many times we actually can do the most for the kingdom in drawing them in. To your question about just some tips, there does need to be boundaries. We are living in a society where, especially with small children, that we need to be very careful. And I think I put some of that in the book. I think I had a section on that from Murray on being careful. What I did was I went out and interviewed people who were known in their communities, Anabaptists who were known in their communities for having a lot of people in their homes. Some of those were foreign students. Some of those were just neighbors. Some of those were inner city. And I tried to get input from them. One of the things that I heard repeatedly was keeping your children with you, not allowing your children to be out of sight with individuals like that. And again, I don't want to portray it as though we are doing this correctly. That's just my own inner wrestling. There are people in my own community, my own church community, who do a better job than we do in this area.
So I have about 3 more questions, but Titus says we have time for about 1 more. I would love to touch on, you bring out the question in the book, but I'll just throw this out for people that listen and can go read the book and see what you had to say about the church family versus the family church. And if you think that through, I think they can pick up what that might mean. But I was challenged by that. Is the church a working together as a family, or is it the place where different families meet once a week?
Sure. Let me just describe what that looks like to a seeker, what a church family looks like. Recently, it was a Muslim family that I got to know pretty well. They actually stayed on our property for a while. They have 6 children. They're from Syria. And he was at a park. He got familiar with several of our families. He was at a park one Sunday afternoon with us. His children were out playing with our children. He turned to me and he said this. He said, in my country, the family is preeminent. We'll do anything for family. He's speaking of biological family. We share, we give, we do anything. But he said, what I see you doing is making a family out of families. And I told him, I said, that's what Jesus came to do. He came to make a family here on earth that anyone's welcome. And this Muslim man said, so anybody can join it then. And I said, that's exactly right. He said, so I could too. And I said, absolutely. That's the purpose of a church family, is the orphan, the widow, the divorcee, the whoever is welcome there. And they can become part of that. So even those with poor biological families can actually come and join and be part of a strong, healthy church family.
Yeah, that's good. I believe you're in the Beachy Church, right? Is that what you're affiliated? No. Okay.
I'm part of a German Baptist Brethren church.
Okay. All right. Well, this doesn't apply quite as much then maybe, but I grew up in the Beachy Church, and now my wife and I are part of Followers of the Way. And one of the main concerns I had there was, there being cultural barriers for Americans or anyone really that are not found in Scripture. Do you think that that's a legitimate concern for some of us to have for the more conservative end of the Anabaptist world, or do you think that that's not the case?
That's absolutely a concern. 15th of Acts talks about asking more of people than these necessary things, or putting a burden on them beyond what God has in mind. So it's absolutely a concern. And I think that's something when we make decisions collectively or agreements within our groups, we need to think about that. The other side, though, is we are also in a culture where none of us want to be told what to do. And so it's very easy to be independent, and in that setting, Jesus said by sacrificial love is how people will know that he is present. So if none of us are submitting to each other, if all of us are simply doing things that make sense to us, there's no opportunity for submission. There's no opportunity to demonstrate to the world that there's something here worth giving something up for. So I personally believe that in our churches, if we are going to demonstrate love to the world around us, if we're going to demonstrate Christianity to people, then we as individuals need to be willing to submit to things that, even though I don't always agree even or even understand it, I'm still willing for the good of my brother to submit to him. And I think there's very few things that get the world's attention like cheerful, willing submission. Just actually loving my fellowship, my group enough. Again, it's kind of interesting. Why do the Amish get so much attention? Why do people drive buses through Amish communities? Well, you can say, well, it's because they still live like the 1700s. I'm not sure that's all of it. I think there's also an attraction there to a people who are willing to commit their lives to each other and give up their own personal individuality, if you will. I'm not saying we should all do that, but I think there's a lesson there we can learn from them, that God can use that in a culture that is extremely self-centered to demonstrate something greater. And I'm not sure that all of us finding a church where we can do what we want to do is ever going to demonstrate that.
Sure.
So at the end of your writing, page 181, you have some lessons that you've learned, and there's 8 of them, I think, and we don't have time for you to touch on all of them. But which one of those has stood out to you the most, or which one of those do you want to share with us has impacted you the most, or think might impact others?
Yeah, I probably can't recall all of them. One of them though is learning to ask good questions instead of making radical statements. Sometimes we try to hit a home run. We try to. When I was a young man, I used to sit down by somebody on the plane and think I was going to, in 4 hours, move somebody from being an atheist to being a sold-out Christian, and that's not our calling many times. I mean, the Lord bless you if that works for you, but I think sometimes our goal should be simply to move them a little closer to the kingdom of God and think of good questions that can do that. I'll share one that just this week I was in a conference there was a man who works a lot in a restricted country, and he was telling about being in a meeting with a group of Muslim imams, him and another Christian, and the rest were all Muslim imams, and this other Christian, they sit down and all the pleasantries were passed and everybody said hello and kind of introduced themselves and got all that out of the way, and then suddenly the Christian that was with him, and I think he was a national from that country, said he told the imams, he addressed them, and he said, I'm just curious about your concept of Christianity. Could you explain to me what you think Christianity is? And it set these men back. It was the last question they were expecting from him. It was like they all kind of looked at each other and they weren't sure what to say, and so they started down this path of, we believe that Christians believe in 3 gods, and all the things that they believed. And he was able, as they just had this open discussion, just to carefully say, well, that's I can see how you would think that, but here's how we actually see it. And he said in about a half hour, this Christian had explained the whole gospel story to these imams. And this man who was telling me about it said, I can't think of another way he could have done that. He could have actually had that opportunity. And I was convicted in listening to that, just in thinking about my own neighbor. So I have a neighbor just across the street that I have wrestled. I've spent a lot of time with him. He's been burnt by religion multiple times. And I want to try that with him. I want to sit down sometime and say, I know you've been burnt and we're living over here and we're Christians, but could you just share with me what you think Christianity is? And start a discussion instead of trying to hit a home run. Another one, you asked for one, I'll hit one I think is really important though, is being transparent about our own doubts with people. I've seen that pull atheists in. if they see a Christian willing to say, you know what, there's some things about God that I don't understand. There's something very compelling to an atheist, much better than a canned answer and some quick response that we come up with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really appreciate all of your wisdom on this topic. And yeah, is there a place where folks can go to get your book, or is Amazon the best place for them to pick it up, or is there somewhere else that you prefer?
TGS is the publisher.
Okay.
It's Christian Aid Ministries site. They have a site. Amazon, you can get it there as well. It has multiple places. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Yeah, I'll put a link for that book in the show notes. Encourage everyone to go pick it up. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and hope to have you on some other time.
Thank you. Lord bless you.
Thank
Same
you.
to you. That Jesus Podcast is part of the Kingdom Outpost Podcast Network. For more articles, podcasts, and other resources, go to kingdomoutpost.org.